Good morning, everybody. The last presentation before lunch is a topic of critical importance to IATA's members, airport privatisation. The focus of this session will be specifically on airport concessions. I'd now like to introduce Hemant Mistry, IATA's Director of Global Airport Infrastructure and Fuel, to my right, and sitting next to him, Dorian Reece, Director of Government Infrastructure for Deloitte. Hemant.
Thank you, Catherine, and good afternoon, everybody. I realise I've got the slot between the slots session and lunch, so it's quite important we get cracking. But it's a very interesting topic, and I hope you find it the same as well. So during the AGM, the IATA AGM in Sydney earlier this year, we provided an overview on airport privatisation, where we've seen issues in terms of increased costs. We've seen shortfalls in terms of service levels, and also the shortfalls in decision-making which have led up to these circumstances. So as Catherine mentioned, this presentation itself is much more focused on airport concessions and the problems we've seen across the world with airport concessions, where we see potential solutions to drive better outcomes for all stakeholders. So that stakeholders that include, of course, the airline customers for the airport, the passengers and other consumers using the airport, the communities the airport serves as well as the traditional beneficiaries of concessions, which have been primarily the government as the asset owner and the private sector company that comes in to operate the airport, which is the concessionaire. And I'll explain more about that as we go through the presentation. Firstly, what I'd like to do is just to provide some very quick background in terms of privatisation. And here you can see some of the issues we've seen generally in terms of privatisation. And, you know, in terms of performance and the expectations as a result of bringing the private sector in, we do see there's been significant shortfalls. And this has really been a result of the fact that when the private operators have come in, we haven't really seen the efficiency gains, which have really been introduced when other industries and other sectors have introduced privatisation. And it also means that the benefits of privatisation have not really been passed on to the end consumer in terms of lower costs, in terms of better service levels. Now, a main reason for that is there's been inadequate regulation of those airports as privatisation has been undertaken. But primarily, at the outset, a major shortfall has been that when the government has really embarked on the privatisation aspect, they focus more on the short-term financial gains. So very often, the vast majority of these transactions, the winning bidder has been selected on the highest financial fee paid or the highest financial gain for the government itself. And this, of course, leads to problems because there's not been enough focus in terms of the overall potential in terms of quality and what the airport should be delivering for the long-term objectives. So to address this, IATA with Deloitte developed a report on airport ownership and regulation to ensure that there's better decision-making as these transactions are actually progressed. And very quickly, there was a whole range of ownership and operating models which are applicable to airports. And what we do say is that you can use a variation of all of these models, including corporatization, mixing corporatization with other aspects, to gain access to financing, to gain access to better opportunities for service level improvement and performance itself. If a government still wants to privatize, and that's moving to the right-hand side of the chart, of course, then what we do want to see is that there is a clear business case that identifies the strategic rationale for doing that and what the benefits are going to be for the consumers and for the customers of the airport itself. And there, one of the main themes, and where we see many transactions for privatisation, is really in terms of concession contracts. So the concession contract is where the government still retains ownership of the airport asset, and it could be, in the case of a new airport development, just the land aspect itself, and then brings in a private sector operator to finance, build, and/or operate the airport itself. So that's a concessionaire itself. This space is quite complicated. There are many models for concession contracts itself. Essentially, it's that contract that is negotiated between those two parties. And this shows you how many concession contracts there already are in terms of individual airports around the world. So you can see there's a lot of concession contracts out there already. The issue we've seen, as we've gone through all of the aspects of these things, is that there are some common themes which really create some shortfalls overall. And experience has shown, as while these two parties, the government and the concessionaire, negotiate the contract, there is a risk that the interests of the contracting parties takes precedence over the other stakeholder interests as well. So, including the airline customers, as I mentioned before, the consumers, the quality of the service is not really being the focus in terms of the decision making, and that impacts the community and the economic benefits which the aviation industry can bring. There are many more concession contracts to come. As I said, this is probably the most likely form of privatization we've pursued in many parts of the world. We are expecting more aviation airport infrastructure build, and to deal with the capacity, we expect governments to really be looking at more concession contracts. But what we do want to see is a significant improvement in terms of the way these concession contracts are actually decided on and actually structured themselves. I'd like to provide you with an overview of some of those pitfalls, some of those shortfalls I mentioned earlier. So historically, airport concessions have suffered from unduly long or arbitrary concession lengths. Now this could be for the benefit of the government because they would be able to negotiate a higher concession fee, or for the concessionaire because they would have longer guaranteed returns. So, for example, if we look at what's happening in France with Airport de Paris, we are looking at a concession proposal of 70 years. That's 70 years, not 17, 70 years. And if we look at, for example, Sydney in Australia, since 2002, it was privatized under a long lease contract, and that was 50 years with a 49-year extension option. So we just have to think about that. And there's other examples where we've seen major shortfalls as well. As I mentioned, the concession fee itself. So this is, for example, where a large proportion of the gross revenue of the airport is diverted to the government, and it doesn't necessarily have to be used back into aviation itself. That puts pressure on charges, of course, and it puts pressure in terms of resisting infrastructure build. And so we see high concession speeds very prevalent in regions like Latin America. And for example, for Santiago de Chile, the gross revenue share with the government is 78%. 78% of the revenue from the airport goes straight to the government. It's not really used for the airport itself. So you can understand the scale of problems that these types of transactions can actually create. There are concessions where there's fixed pricing, basically, which is set from the outset of the concession itself. So if it's a 40-year concession, you've got a fixed pricing formula. So it's nothing to do with the service provided or the infrastructure built. There's a problem. And then there's issues where there's infrastructure is actually set within the concession contract, and it's not even discussed with the users of the airport. So it's not fit for purpose. So these are just some of the examples that we see. And I say they're quite common across the concession contracts themselves, and mainly because they've just been negotiated between the two parties. So these bad practices can't really continue as we go forward. And what we'd like to see is a move away from this vicious cycle of increased costs and suboptimal infrastructure itself. Now, given the nature of airport assets being built, including the technological advances, and you're going to hear more about those advances, I think, this afternoon as well. You know, it's very difficult to understand what the size, scope, and function of an airport is going to be in, say, 40 years' time, for example. Right? There is a very important need to have an enforced collaboration mechanism between the airport and the customers to make sure that capital planning is done basically according to the needs, the market needs, and to ensure the day-to-day operations are fit for purpose for the people that use and pay for the service. That includes service levels. What are the required service levels, and when should they be reviewed, etc., based on how the market evolves. So rather than creating the adversarial differing objectives that you see in the vicious cycle, what we want to see, of course, is a move towards a more balanced concession contract. One which basically identifies the similar interests, there's clarity in terms of how the interactions will be between the stakeholders, and it allows a more virtuous circle itself, which benefits the aviation industry, mitigating risk, delivering innovation, better public value, and also an improved customer experience. It's fundamentally important as we go forward as well. So this whole notion of the balanced concession is something which we see as a great opportunity for the industry moving forward in terms of infrastructure development itself. The process of the balanced concession contract comes under four main principles. They are collaboration, transparency and information sharing, mutual interest, and also balanced risk and reward sharing. So this would allow, following these principles, allow airlines, customers, consumers' interest to be taken into account during the definition of appropriate service levels. And the process of collaboration, of course, also creates win-wins for all parties, which is fundamentally important. And this, in turn, can actually better serve the public interest as airports enable expeditious travel, connecting people, connecting markets through functionally, timely, and technologically aligned infrastructure. That wasn't bad, I don't know what that is. Right, so to facilitate this, moving towards a balanced concession contract, IATA with Deloitte, we've defined a series of solutions which can be built into future or renegotiated concession contracts. These can be categorized into 7 main themes of guidelines. First of all, determination of the optimum concession length. How to avoid unnecessarily long concessions. As I mentioned, with technology advancing as it is, how can you predict what the future role of the airport will be in, say, 40 years' time, etc. So let's optimize that and not have an unnecessarily long concession length itself. Consultation process. How do you ensure that the changing market needs of airlines and passengers are addressed during the concession life cycle itself? Because those markets will change over time significantly. You cannot set from the outset what the operating model of the airport is going to be, which has been part of the problem. Capital expenditure and execution. How do you consult with airlines to make sure that infrastructure is timely and is functional? Concession payments. How do you avoid the airport being used as a cash cow to avoid situations like I mentioned before in terms of the gross revenue share, etc. And continual improvement in airport service quality. How do you set those service quality, those service level metrics, and how can you monitor those? Super profit protection. Well, actually, that's a very simple term, which is probably not the right one, because basically what we're looking at here is how do you share the risks? How do you incentivize all the parties to perform better? How do you incentivize both the airlines and the airport itself to actually achieve common goals? And then selection of airport concessionaires, how do you have that balanced scorecard? So you're not, as a government, just looking at the financial return itself, you're looking at the overall objective and value the airport will create as a result of the tender proposal itself. So of course, IATA supports efforts to facilitate appropriate investment in airport infrastructure. We're committed to securing the best value outcome for aviation overall. Airports and airlines fail or succeed together. We know that. Timely delivery of cost-efficient infrastructure and airport service is good for everyone, be that for the government, for airport concessionaires, for airlines, or the consumer. And what we've done, following the assessment we've done around the world, is we've just launched a report today, which basically defines the balanced concession concept. And the report explores a myriad of case studies, like some of the ones I explained, but there's a whole host more as well. And also looks at specific cases in terms of other sectors where there's been lessons learned, how we can build on all of that information to create a better process for concessions, the balanced concession. And the output is in the form of working solutions which any government can use if they are moving towards a concession contract environment for their airport. Okay? So thank you very much.
Thank you, Hemant. I'd now like to open the floor to any questions.
Curry, Travel Extra in Ireland. A question for Hemant. You flagged the concerns about